It all started on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. Jake was in a hurry, weaving through the crowded streets, his mind tangled with worries about work and deadlines. He barely noticed the world around him until he collided with someone. Books tumbled to the ground. A quiet gasp followed. When he looked up, he saw her, Emily. She was flustered, trying to gather her things, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake bent down to help, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second. And that was it. A spark, a moment that neither of them could explain. They didn't know it yet, but this simple accident, this brief encounter, was about to change both of their lives in ways they never imagined. Fate has a funny way of working, doesn't it? Sometimes it leads us to people when we least expect it, in the most unexpected ways. But what if this wasn't just a coincidence? What if this was meant to happen? As they locked eyes for that fleeting moment, something shifted. And from that second on, nothing would ever be the same again. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the busy street faded into the background as Jake and Emily stared at each other, something unspoken hanging in the air. Then, just as quickly as it happened, the moment passed. Emily gave a polite smile, gathering the last of her books, and stood up. "Thanks," he said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Jake nodded, but something about her lingered in his mind even as she turned to leave. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her before. There was a familiarity in her eyes, something that stirred a memory just out of reach. He watched as she disappeared into the crowd, and for the first time in a long while, work was the last thing on his mind. Emily, on the other hand, walked away with her heart pounding. She had recognized Jake the moment their eyes met. It had been years, too many years, but she remembered. Did he? Or was she just another stranger to him? Neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And the past they thought they had left behind was about to resurface in ways they never expected. Jake couldn't focus for the rest of the day. No matter how much he tried to push the encounter out of his mind, Emily's face kept coming back to him. That feeling, like he should have known her, refused to fade. He told himself it was just a passing thought, but deep down, something told him it wasn't. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, flashes of old memories surfaced. A warm summer day, laughter echoing in the air, the faint scent of vanilla. Why did it all feel connected to her? Meanwhile, Emily sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought about the past, about the version of Jake who had once been a part of her life. Back then, things had been different, simpler, maybe. But time had a way of changing people, of pulling them in different directions. She had convinced herself that chapter was closed, yet seeing him again had brought everything rushing back. She wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but was it really? Somewhere, hidden in their past, was an unfinished story, one neither of them was ready to face. And fate wasn't done with them yet. Days passed, but neither Jake nor Emily could shake the feeling that their meeting had been more than chance. The city felt smaller now, as if it was pulling them toward each other again. And then it happened. Jake was walking home late one evening when he spotted her across the street, sitting alone at a cafe. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to go in. But before he could decide, Emily looked up, and their eyes met again. This time, neither of them looked away. He stepped inside, the air thick with unspoken words. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. The silence between them was heavy, both knowing there was more beneath the surface. "I remember," Jake finally said, his voice quiet. Emily's breath caught. She had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready. There was something from their past, something unfinished, unresolved. And now, after all these years, it was forcing its way back. Just as Emily opened her mouth to speak, a familiar voice interrupted them. One neither of them expected to hear. And in that instant, everything changed. Jake turned toward the voice, his stomach tightening before he even saw who it was. Emily's face had already gone pale. Standing just a few feet away was Ryan, someone neither of them had seen in years, yet someone they could never forget. Ryan's eyes flickered between them, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Then he let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Wow. Never thought I'd see the two of you together again," he said, his tone unreadable. Emily gripped the edge of the table. She hadn't planned for this. Running into Jake was one thing, unexpected but manageable. But Ryan, that was different. That was dangerous. Jake sat back, his mind racing. The memories came flooding back now, clearer than ever. Late nights, whispered conversations, promises that were never kept. And then the fallout, the kind that left scars deeper than either of them had admitted. "What do you want, Ryan?" Emily's voice was steady, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. Ryan smirked. "I think you already know." And just like that, the past they had tried so hard to forget came crashing back, pulling them into something neither of them was ready for. Jake's jaw tightened as he looked at Ryan, the weight of their shared past pressing down on him. Emily, still frozen in place, seemed to be holding her breath. She knew exactly what Ryan meant, and so did Jake. There was unfinished business between the three of them, something they had all tried to bury. Ryan pulled out a chair and sat down, his smirk never fading. "You really don't remember, do you, Jake?" he said, tilting his head. "Or maybe you just don't want to." Jake's hands curled into fists under the table. He had spent years trying to move on, but now, with Ryan sitting across from him, it all came rushing back. The betrayal, the secret they had sworn to keep, and the one night that had changed everything. Emily finally spoke, her voice sharp. "We agreed to leave it in the past, Ryan." Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Well, the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it? And this time, you don't get to walk away." Jake glanced at Emily, and in her eyes he saw the truth. She had known this moment was coming. And now there was no way out. But then, just as Ryan was about to say more, Emily did something Jake never expected. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small envelope, and slid it across the table. "It's over," she said firmly. Ryan's smirk faded as he picked it up, his expression shifting from amusement to shock. He opened the envelope, and for the first time that night, he was speechless. Jake leaned in, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he asked. Emily looked at him, her voice steady. "The truth." And just like that, everything changed. Ryan's hands trembled as he held the envelope, his confidence fading. He stared at the paper inside, his face unreadable. Seconds passed, heavy with tension. Then, without a word, he exhaled sharply and pushed the envelope back toward Emily. "So that's how it is," he muttered. Emily nodded, her expression calm but firm. "It's done, Ryan. We all need to move on." Jake watched in silence, piecing it all together. Whatever was inside that envelope, it was the one thing Ryan hadn't expected. Something that took away his control, his power over them. And just like that, the fight was over before it even began. Ryan stood up, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Guess I underestimated you," he said, his voice almost amused. Then, with one last glance at them, he walked away, disappearing into the city lights. Emily let out a breath she'd been holding. Jake turned to her, still searching for answers. "Are you going to tell me what was in there?" She smiled, a hint of relief in her eyes. "Maybe someday." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Some things were better left unsaid. But one thing was clear. Whatever had tied them to the past was finally over. And for the first time in years, they were free.